Somewhere in this list, a merchant is closing a ledger by candlelight, certain he has just made his fortune. Somewhere else in it, another merchant closes an identical ledger, feeling the exact same certainty, and only one of them turns out to be right. That gap between what money feels like in the moment and what it turns out to have actually done is what 50 Rules of Money keeps circling back to. This is not a show about what to do with your money. It never has been. It is a show about what humans have already done with theirs. The kings who gave too much away, the bankers who lent to the wrong crown, the philosophers who preached restraint from inside a fortune, the gamblers who bet against a wheel with no memory. History has been running this experiment for 4,000 years, and the results are calmer, stranger, and more useful than anything sold as advice. 50 rules are ahead, drawn from Babylon, Florence, Amsterdam, and rooms far quieter than any of them. Some will sound familiar the moment they arrive. A few were true in every century anyone has bothered to check, and one of them, near the middle of this list, quietly decides who stays rich and who only looks like it for a while. Settle in. The ledger is always still open. In the year 1324, a king named Mansa Musa rode into Cairo with a caravan so heavy with gold that merchants there would remember it for a generation. He was the ruler of the Mali Empire, a West African kingdom whose wealth came largely from gold and salt, and he was on his way to Mecca. Along the route, he gave gold away freely to the poor, to officials, to anyone who asked, apparently unconcerned with what it might do to the value of the metal he was scattering behind him. What it did was straightforward and severe. Cairo's gold market absorbed far more bullion than it could use, and the price of gold there collapsed and stayed low for years afterward. By some later accounts, more than a decade. One man's generosity had, without any intention of conquest or commerce, reshaped a regional economy simply by putting too much of one thing into too many hands too quickly. Musa is said to have noticed the damage on his way home and tried to undo it, borrowing gold back from Cairo's moneylenders at whatever interest they demanded, hoping to pull enough of it out of circulation to let prices recover. When he later repaid the loans in one lump sum, the market reportedly dipped again, as if the mere reappearance of his gold were enough to unsettle it a second time. The episode gets told often as proof of Musa's staggering wealth, and it is that. But it is just as much a story about how value works. Not as some fixed property of gold itself, but as a relationship between how much of a thing exists in a place and how many people want it there. Flood a market with anything, even something as durable and desired as gold, and its meaning changes. Contemporary Arab chroniclers, writing decades after the journey, described a retinue numbering in the thousands and pack animals loaded with gold dust and bars, details later historians treat as broadly credible, even though no one at the time rigorously counted the actual total. Cairo's price recovered years later. Mansa Musa's reputation as one of history's wealthiest men never did. For roughly 7 centuries, the English government kept many of its accounts on sticks of willow wood. A clerk would notch a stick to record a sum owed to the crown, then split it lengthwise so both halves showed the same notches, one kept by the government and one given to the person who was owed. The two halves fit only against each other, which made the tally stick almost impossible to forge, and the system worked, in its rough way, from the Middle Ages until the early 1800s. By 1834, the practice had been replaced by paper ledgers for years, and the exchequer was left holding 2 cartloads of obsolete sticks with no further use. Someone decided the simplest solution was to burn them in the furnaces beneath the House of Lords. Those furnaces were built for coal, which burns hot with little flame. The dry wood produced far more fire than the flues were designed to carry, and by evening the heat had ignited the floor above. The Palace of Westminster, the medieval building that had housed Parliament for hundreds of years, burned through the night. Crowds gathered along the Thames to watch, among them the landscape painter Turner, who later turned the blaze into some of his most famous paintings. A parliamentary inquiry afterward named the burning tallies as the direct cause. The rebuilding that followed gave London the Gothic Revival Houses of Parliament that still stand today, designed by the architect Charles Barry after a public competition, complete with the clock tower that would eventually house the bell known as Big Ben. None of it would have been necessary had someone simply chosen a woodpile instead of a furnace. It is a strange kind of justice. A record-keeping system built to be unforgeable and permanent ended up destroying the very institution it had once served, through nothing more sinister than bureaucratic tidying gone wrong. The old debts were long since settled. Only the building had to pay. In the early weeks of 1637, in the Dutch Republic, a single tulip bulb of a striped variety called Semper Augustus changed hands for a sum that would have bought one of the largest houses on an Amsterdam canal, garden and coach house included. Tulips, newly imported by way of the Ottoman Empire and prone to a virus that streaked their petals in unpredictable patterns, had become an object of intense fascination among merchants, weavers, and minor gentry. Because a bulb could only be judged once a year when it flowered, traders increasingly bought and sold not the flowers themselves, but contracts promising a future bulb, a practice later nicknamed the wind trade, since nothing solid changed hands until the season came around. Then, within weeks, the market collapsed. Buyers stopped showing up to auctions, contracts went unhonored, and the trade that had briefly made a single bulb worth more than gold simply stopped functioning. The episode is often retold as a story of an entire nation gripped by madness, ordinary citizens mortgaging homes for flowers before losing everything when the bubble burst. The archival record tells a narrower story. The historian Anne Goldgar, working through surviving contracts and court records, found the trading circle was smaller than legend suggests, mostly wealthy merchants and skilled craftsmen who could absorb a loss. And that verified cases of true ruin are surprisingly hard to find. The panic was real, and the collapse was sudden. The scale of devastation later writers attached to it seems to have grown with each retelling, becoming a tidy fable about greed long after the actual traders had moved on with their lives. What survives clearly is the shape of the thing itself, an asset with no practical use beyond its beauty and rarity, traded on the expectation that someone else would always pay more for it tomorrow, until the day nobody did. The bulbs, once the panic passed, went back to simply being flowers. When Henry VIII and his successors began reducing the silver content of English coins while keeping their face value the same, ordinary people responded with a quiet, entirely rational instinct. They kept the old, heavier coins at home and spent the new, thinner ones first. Nobody had to explain the logic to them. A coin containing more real silver was worth more than its stamped value if melted down or weighed. So the sensible thing to do with good money was to hoard it, and the sensible thing to do with bad money was to get rid of it fast, before anyone else caught on. The financier Sir Thomas Gresham described this pattern to Elizabeth I while advising her on how to restore confidence in England's currency after her predecessors had debased it for a generation. The behavior was not new even then. Something like it had been noticed as far back as ancient Greece, where clipped and shaved coins drove full-weight ones out of everyday circulation in much the same way. But Gresham's name stuck to the principle, later summarized by a Victorian economist as bad money drives out good. The mechanism only works, worth noting, when two forms of money are forced to circulate at the same official value, despite having different real worth. Left alone, a market would simply price the two differently. It is the fixed rate, the rule compelling a debased coin to be accepted at face value alongside a sound one, that creates the incentive to squirrel away the good money and unload the bad. The pattern has resurfaced wherever similar conditions appear, from wartime coin shortages to currencies existing alongside black market alternatives. And modern economists still reach for Gresham's framing whenever one form of money quietly starts disappearing from circulation, while a shakier substitute keeps doing all the day-to-day work. Every debasement, in the end, is a quiet test of who notices first. Carved into a stone pillar nearly 4,000 years ago, in the Babylon of King Hammurabi, is a legal code that spends a striking amount of its attention on money. Alongside its well-known punishments for crimes, the code sets specific interest rate ceilings for loans of grain and loans of silver, spells out how a farmer's debt could be settled after a bad harvest, and describes when a person could be handed over to work off what was owed. It is one of the oldest surviving attempts to put a formal, public limit, on what a lender could demand from a borrower. The rates the code allowed were themselves specific. Contemporary translations commonly cite a ceiling of around 20% annually on loans of silver, and up to a third on loans of grain. Generous figures by modern standards, but nonetheless a hard, publicly known limit in a world where a private lender could otherwise demand whatever a desperate borrower would agree to, simply to survive the season. That instinct, that debt-needed rules a private handshake could not be trusted to enforce fairly, turns out to be nearly universal. Centuries later, in an entirely different part of the world, Germanic law codes built something similar from a different angle. A wergild, literally a man price, a fixed schedule of compensation owed for injuring or killing another person, functioning as a kind of debt law for violence itself, meant to stop blood feuds by putting a number on harm. Roman civil law, developing later still, spent enormous energy on the same basic problem: what is owed, to whom, and by when. None of these societies could have known about the other solutions. Babylon predates Rome by well over 1,000 years, and the Germanic codes were written down centuries after both, yet each arrived at nearly the same conclusion. Left to private negotiation between a powerful creditor and a desperate borrower, debt would simply crush the weaker party, so the community had to write the limits down somewhere everyone could see them. 4,000 years on, the tablet has outlasted the empire that carved it, which is more than most contracts manage. Long before anything resembling a bankruptcy court existed, the rulers of ancient Mesopotamia grappled with a problem modern economies still wrestle with: debt. Left alone, only compounds. A farmer who borrowed grain to survive one bad season, then another, could end up owing far more than he could ever repay, selling first his land, then his own labor, then his family's labor, into servitude to a creditor. Sumerian and Babylonian kings addressed this not with a court process, but with a proclamation. Periodically, a new ruler would declare a clean slate, canceling agricultural debts and freeing those who had been bonded into service because of them. Archaeologists have recovered several such Mesopotamian proclamations inscribed on clay tablets, describing debts canceled and, in some versions, prices for staple goods reset. Evidence that these were administrative acts a scribe somewhere was tasked with recording and enforcing, not merely later legend. The Mesopotamian terms for such a decree, often rendered as andurarum or misharum, depending on the dynasty and period, translate roughly to freedom or justice, underscoring that these were understood at the time as restorations of a proper order rather than emergency exceptions to it. The idea did not stay buried in Mesopotamia. The Hebrew Bible describes something strikingly similar in the book of Leviticus, a jubilee year, arriving every 50 years, in which debts were to be forgiven, enslaved countrymen freed, and ancestral land returned to the families who had originally held it. Scholars still debate how consistently either the Mesopotamian decrees or the biblical jubilee were actually carried out in practice, as opposed to how they were meant to work on paper. But the underlying logic runs through both. A society that lets debt accumulate without any reset risks concentrating everything, land, labor, and freedom itself, in the hands of whoever held the paper. Modern bankruptcy law does something quieter and more individual, discharging one person's debts at a time rather than declaring a blanket jubilee for everyone at once. But the founding insight is the one carved into clay 4,000 years ago. Money owed is a claim on someone else's future, and every society that has taken debt seriously has eventually had to decide how much of that claim is allowed to stand forever. Even the oldest ledgers needed an eraser some way. In 1716, a Scottish gambler and financial theorist named John Law persuaded the French regent to let him open a bank with the authority to print paper currency, an idea France's own finance ministers had considered too dangerous to try. Law's real ambition was larger still. A year later, he folded in a trading company holding the rights to develop French territory along the Mississippi River, then merged it with France's other colonial trading monopolies until his company controlled nearly all of the country's overseas commerce. By 1719, the company held exclusive rights to French trade with Louisiana, Canada, and the West Indies, along with the Crown's tobacco monopoly and its coinage minting rights, an unprecedented concentration of commercial power inside one privately run enterprise answering directly to the state. Shares in the company became the most sought-after investment in Europe, driven less by any actual profit flowing back from Louisiana, which had produced little of the promised gold and silver, than by the simple fact that the price kept rising, and everyone assumed it would keep rising further. Law's bank printed notes to keep pace with demand, and for a short while, it seemed France had discovered a way to create wealth simply by deciding to. Share prices climbed from a few hundred livres to 10,000 at their peak within about 2 years, and the mania even left behind a new word, millionaire, coined around this time in French to describe the paper fortunes speculators believed they had made. The unwinding, when it came, was fast. Investors who tried to convert their paper profits into hard coin found there was nowhere near enough metal in France to cover it, and the price collapsed, first slowly, then all at once, falling to a small fraction of its peak within months. Law, blamed for the wreck of the entire scheme, fled the country he had briefly seemed to refinance from nothing, and died years later in Venice, considerably poorer than he had once made half of Paris feel. France would not trust paper money again for the better part of a century. In the winter of 1920, a Boston-based Italian immigrant named Charles Ponzi began promising investors he could double their money within 90 days. Through a scheme built around international postal reply coupons, a real but obscure financial instrument that let someone in one country prepay return postage for someone in another. Small price differences between currencies meant there was, in theory, a genuine profit to be made buying coupons cheaply abroad and redeeming them at a higher value elsewhere. In practice, the trade could never move at the scale Ponzi's promises required. A Boston newspaper's later investigation calculated that covering every outstanding note Ponzi had issued would have required far more postal reply coupons than existed in worldwide circulation at the time, a gap that made the fraud mathematically obvious once anyone bothered to check. So Ponzi did what the scheme's later imitators would do for the next century. He paid early investors their promised returns using money deposited by new investors, creating the appearance of a wildly profitable business for as long as new money kept arriving faster than old money had to be paid out. For a few months, it worked spectacularly. Ponzi took in millions of dollars, bought a mansion, and became something of a folk hero in Boston before the newspaper investigation and a federal audit exposed that almost none of the promised coupon trading was actually happening. The scheme collapsed within months of its peak, and Ponzi went to prison before eventually being deported back to Italy, where he spent much of his later life in far reduced circumstances, reportedly working for a period as a translator before his death in a charity hospital ward in Rio de Janeiro. The scheme's name has since become the default label investigators reach for whenever a new fraud surfaces built on the same underlying structure, regardless of the specific product or era it happens to be dressed in. Every generation seems to discover the structure fresh, usually just before the money runs out. Ask most people whether they would rather receive a sum of money outright or take a coin flip that could either double it or lose it entirely. And even when the mathematical expectation of the gamble is identical to the guaranteed amount, most decline the bet. The reason has less to do with arithmetic than with an asymmetry the psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky documented across dozens of experiments. The pain of losing a given amount of money registers, on average, roughly twice as strongly as the pleasure of gaining that same amount. This asymmetry, which the two researchers called loss aversion, became one of the central pillars of prospect theory, the framework they built to describe how people actually weigh risk, as opposed to how classical economic models assumed they should. It explains a great deal of behavior that looks irrational from the outside, but makes emotional sense from within. Investors who hold on to a losing stock far longer than a winning one, hoping to avoid locking in the loss. People who turn down favorable bets they would happily offer if the roles were reversed. The outsized relief of merely breaking even after a bad stretch, disproportionate to the actual money involved. The same asymmetry appears in something as ordinary as a household budget. A sudden, unexpected bill tends to sour a person's mood far more sharply and for longer than an equally sized unexpected bonus tends to lift it, even though the two amounts are numerically identical and would simply cancel each other out on a balance sheet. Kahneman went on to receive a Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences for the broader research program built around this and related findings. Unusual recognition for a psychologist working in a field dominated by economists. The finding has since been replicated across cultures and income levels, though researchers continue to debate exactly how large the effect runs in any given context. A loss and a gain of equal size are never quite equal at all. Before the 7th century BC, trade across the ancient world ran on weighed metal, grain, or livestock, and every transaction required someone to verify on the spot how much the payment was actually worth. In the Kingdom of Lydia, in what is now Western Turkey, rulers began striking small lumps of electrum, a pale natural alloy of gold and silver panned from local riverbeds, into standardized discs stamped with an official mark. The mark was the innovation. It told anyone accepting the coin that a recognized authority had already verified its weight and purity, so the coin's face, not a merchant's scale, could be trusted to vouch for its worth. Archaeologists recovered some of the earliest surviving examples in deposits beneath the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, finds that have allowed historians to date the innovation with unusual confidence. Lydia's kings grew wealthy on the trade this made easier, none more famously than Croesus, whose name would become a byword for riches across the ancient world and still lingers in English today. Croesus later refined his predecessor's electrum coinage into separate gold and silver denominations of guaranteed purity, a bimetallic system precise enough that later Persian and Greek coinages borrowed its underlying logic directly. The innovation spread quickly once Greek city-states saw what it enabled. A coin let a soldier be paid in the field, a merchant cross a border without hauling scales and assay tools, and a government collect taxes in a form it could count rather than weigh. None of this required inventing money itself. Humans had exchanged value in one form or another for millennia. It required only the smaller, stranger idea that a stamped piece of metal could be trusted to mean the same thing in a stranger's hand as it did in your own. Weight standards varied considerably across the ancient Near East before this innovation, and a coin's guaranteed purity solved a trust problem merchants had previously managed informally and imperfectly, city by city. That trust, once it took hold, never really let go. The Medici family entered Florentine commerce as wool merchants and small-time moneylenders, unremarkable among dozens of similar families competing for business in a crowded market. What set them apart over the following century was a network, bank branches established in cities across Europe, from Rome to Bruges, staffed by trusted partners rather than employees, sharing risk and profit under contracts renewed every few years so that no single branch's failure could sink the whole enterprise. At its height, the bank operated branches in cities including Rome, Venice, Milan, Geneva, London, and Bruges, each run under local partnership agreements that let the family profit from distant trade without personally managing every transaction. That network made the Medici bankers to popes a lucrative and politically useful position that funneled papal revenues through Medici accounts, and to princes across the continent who needed credit for wars, dowries, and building projects. The fortune this produced funded an extraordinary flowering of Florentine art and architecture. Cosimo de' Medici and his descendants underwrote painters, sculptors, and architects, including Botticelli and later Michelangelo, embedding Medici money directly into some of the most recognizable images the Renaissance produced. The bank itself did not survive its founder's caution intact. Later generations of Medici leadership, more interested in politics and prestige than in the ledger discipline that had built the fortune, extended large loans to unreliable royal clients, most damagingly the English crown under Edward IV, who defaulted outright. Branches began closing through the late 1400s, and by the early 1500s, the banking operation that had financed half of Europe's princes had quietly wound down, even as the family's political dynasty, by then ruling Florence outright, continued for centuries more. The bank's own account books, remarkably, still survive in Florentine archives today, letting modern historians trace individual loans and partnerships in a level of detail few medieval institutions of any kind left behind. The palaces and chapels the bank paid for are still standing. The bank that paid for them is not, and has not been for 500 years. By the year 301, the Roman Empire had been living with a slow currency crisis for decades, as successive emperors quietly reduced the silver content of their coins to stretch government spending further. Ordinary people responded the way people usually do when they sense their money is worth less than it claims to be. They raised the prices they charged for goods and demanded more coins for the same bread, wine, or wool as before. The Emperor Diocletian, faced with what looked like runaway inflation, decided the answer was to fix prices by decree. His edict on maximum prices set legal ceilings on the cost of well over 1,000 goods and services, from wheat and wine to skilled labor, with death as the stated penalty for anyone charging more. It was, by surviving standards, an extraordinarily detailed document, listing prices down to specific cuts of meat and grades of cloth, quoted in a notional accounting unit rather than any coin still in genuine circulation, an early and telling acknowledgement that the actual currency in people's pockets could no longer be trusted to hold a stable value at all. Fragments of the edict, carved into stone and displayed publicly across the empire's cities so no merchant could plead ignorance of the law, have survived in enough pieces that historians have been able to reconstruct large portions of its original price lists. It did not work the way it was meant to. Merchants faced with a legal price lower than what their goods actually cost to produce or transport simply stopped selling openly, and trade shifted into unofficial channels the edict had no power to see, let alone enforce. Shortages of goods that had been freely available before the edict began appearing in the historical record within a few years, and enforcement quietly lapsed even before Diocletian's own reign ended. The edict addressed the symptom, rising prices, rather than the cause, a currency that had been quietly hollowed out for 100 years, and no price written into law could make a coin worth more than the metal actually left inside it. The denarius, when the Roman Republic first minted it, was a coin of nearly pure silver, trusted enough to become the backbone of currency across the ancient Mediterranean for centuries. Almost no emperor who followed set out to destroy that trust outright. Each simply shaved the silver content down a little, to stretch a treasury that had to pay armies, fund building projects, and cover the costs of empire without the politically painful step of raising taxes directly. Nero's reign brought an early, modest reduction. Successive emperors continued the pattern in small increments across the following 2 centuries, each cut small enough that a soldier or shopkeeper handling the coin day to day would have struggled to notice any difference from the year before. Compounded across generations, though, the effect was severe. By the empire's 3rd century crisis, a period of civil war, plague, and constant turnover at the top, the coin, nominally still called a denarius, had become little more than a thin silver wash over a core of cheap base metal. Modern metallurgical analysis of surviving coins, rather than any single ancient account, is what has let researchers trace the debasement's pace so precisely, measuring the actual silver content, coin by coin, across 3 centuries of the empire's own money. Prices, predictably, rose to match, and the empire's finances entered a spiral that price edicts and currency reforms struggled for decades to fully unwind. The eventual fix came only when the Emperor Constantine introduced an entirely new gold coin, the solidus, deliberately kept free of the debasement that had ruined the denarius, and struck to a purity standard disciplined enough that it remained the backbone of Byzantine currency for another 700 years. A currency can be hollowed out so gradually that no single generation ever feels the theft. Only the grandchildren who inherit a coin that buys a fraction of what their great-grandparents' coin once did. Croesus, king of Lydia in the 6th century BC, had inherited and expanded one of the wealthiest kingdoms of the ancient world, its riches built on gold panned from local rivers, and the coinage his predecessors had pioneered. According to the historian Herodotus, writing a century or so after the events he described, Croesus once asked the visiting Athenian lawgiver Solon a question he expected only one answer to. Who was the happiest man Solon had ever encountered? Solon named 2 obscure Greeks, neither of them rich, both of whom had died well regarded and at peace. When Croesus, unsatisfied, pressed him to at least rank the king's own happiness somewhere on the list, Solon reportedly answered that no life could be called fortunate until it had ended, since circumstance could still turn against even the wealthiest man alive. Croesus, the story goes, dismissed the advice as the bitterness of a man with nothing to lose. Years later, having gone to war against the rising Persian Empire, Croesus lost his kingdom and was captured by the Persian king Cyrus, who, in Herodotus's fuller account, ordered him placed on a funeral pyre to be burned alive, only to spare him after Croesus cried out Solon's name and explained the old warning to his captor, a scene ancient audiences clearly found as instructive as it was dramatic. Whether Cyrus truly relented for that reason, or the detail was added later to sharpen the story's moral, is a question historians still debate. The account was written down generations after the fact, and carries the shape of a fable as much as a historical record. The story's staying power owes something to how neatly it reverses expectation. The obscure man Solon named as fortunate should, by every obvious measure, have envied the king, not the other way around. What survived regardless was the phrase itself. Rich as Croesus entered languages far from Lydia, carrying with it, whether anyone using it today remembers or not, the warning that came attached. High in the Andes, above what is now the Bolivian city of Potosi, sits a reddish mountain called Cerro Rico, Rich Hill in Spanish. Indigenous prospectors are thought to have known of silver there before the Spanish arrived, but it was after a formal discovery in 1545 that the mountain became the engine of an empire. Within a few decades, Potosi had grown from a mining camp into one of the largest cities anywhere in the world, its population rivaling London's and Paris, built entirely around one purpose: pulling silver out of the mountain and shipping it across oceans to Spanish treasuries. The mint established at Potosi struck silver coins known as pieces of 8, which circulated so widely across global trade routes from Europe to China to Spain's own colonies in the Philippines that they functioned for a time as something close to an early global reserve currency, accepted on trust in ports the Spanish crown never controlled directly. Potosi silver flowed onward to China in particular, where demand for the metal ran so strong that a considerable share of the world's silver production eventually passed through Spanish and Portuguese hands into Asian markets. That wealth came at an enormous human cost. The forced labor system Spanish colonial authorities imposed on indigenous workers and later on enslaved Africans to work the mines and the mercury refining process alongside them killed enormous numbers of people over the mountain's working life, a toll historians continue to study and debate the true scale of. The mountain itself, mined continuously for centuries, is honeycombed today with tunnels and has visibly subsided from its original height. Mining continues there even now, on a smaller scale, run largely by independent cooperative miners, working conditions that remain notably dangerous. Cerro Rico paid for an empire and hollowed out a mountain doing it, and the bill for both is still being tallied. Starting in the 16th century, Spanish ships began carrying enormous quantities of silver across the Atlantic from mines in the Americas, much of it eventually working its way into European markets through trade and royal spending. Over the following century or so, prices across much of Europe rose steadily and substantially, a shift contemporaries felt acutely but struggled to explain, since nothing about the goods themselves, the wheat, the wool, the wine, had changed. Economists writing at the School of Salamanca in Spain, a group of scholars working within a religious university tradition, rather than anything resembling a modern economics department, were among the first to propose an explanation that has held up remarkably well since. The Spanish theologian Martin de Azpilicueta, writing at Salamanca, gave the idea one of its clearest early statements, observing that money was worth more in places where it was scarce, and less where, as in Spain itself, it had grown abundant, a strikingly modern insight from a 16th century friar. The underlying logic was straightforward, once stated. When the amount of silver circulating in an economy increases faster than the amount of goods available to buy, each unit of silver simply buys less. Historians now call the period the price revolution, and while American silver was not the only factor at work, population growth and shifting trade patterns played their own roles. It remains one of the clearest documented cases of sustained inflation from the pre-modern world. Wages, which adjusted more slowly than the price of basic goods, lagged behind the rise for decades, meaning many working households felt the inflation as a steady tightening long before anyone had a settled word for what was squeezing them. Contemporary accounts from Spain itself, including complaints from royal officials about the rising cost of provisioning the court, give a vivid, if informal, sense of just how disorienting the shift felt while it was actually happening. Money could lose its footing even while every coin in it stayed exactly the same weight of silver it had always been. In a now classic experiment, the psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman had participants spin a wheel marked from 0 to 100, rigged so it only ever landed on 10 or 65, though nobody watching had any reason to suspect the rigging. Immediately afterward, they asked each participant an entirely unrelated question: what percentage of member countries in the United Nations were African nations? Participants who had just seen the wheel land on 10 guessed low. Those who saw it land on 65 guessed considerably higher. The number from the wheel had nothing to do with the actual answer, and participants knew when asked directly that the spin was random and irrelevant to geography. Their estimates drifted toward it anyway. This is the anchoring effect. An arbitrary figure, encountered immediately before a judgment, quietly pulls that judgment toward itself, even when the person making the judgment can identify out loud that the figure should have no bearing at all. Later studies extended the effect into settings with real consequences. Experienced judges asked to recommend a criminal sentence gave harsher numbers after being shown a high figure, even one generated by rolling dice in front of them, than judges shown a low figure under otherwise identical case facts. Restaurant menus exploit the same tendency deliberately, placing one conspicuously expensive dish near the top, specifically to make everything listed beneath it look by comparison reasonably priced. A house listed at a certain price anchors buyers' sense of its value, even before they have compared it to anything similar. Salary negotiations show the same dynamic in reverse. Whichever side names a number first, an employer's opening offer, or a candidate's stated expectation, tends to anchor the entire conversation that follows, regardless of what either party privately believes the role is actually worth. The first number spoken in any room rarely leaves the room unheard. For nearly 2 centuries, a story has circulated that the London banker Nathan Rothschild learned of Wellington's victory over Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, a full day before the news reached anyone else in Britain, and used the secret to make an enormous fortune manipulating the stock exchange, first spreading a rumor of British defeat to crash the market, then quietly buying up government bonds at collapsed prices before the truth arrived. It is a wonderful story, and historians who have gone looking for evidence of it have found essentially none. The tale traces back to an anonymous pamphlet published decades after Rothschild's death, full of vivid details: a storm-tossed channel crossing, a lone rider racing to London, that later researchers have shown to be invented outright. The pamphlet's prejudiced undertones, casting a Jewish banker as secretly manipulating markets through concealed knowledge, likely helped the story spread as readily as it did, a detail historians examining the myth's persistence rarely leave out. There is no reliable evidence Rothschild even learned of the victory meaningfully before other well-connected Londoners did. What Rothschild actually did afterward was considerably less dramatic and considerably more instructive. He had in fact built his London reputation over the preceding decade through a genuinely fast, genuinely extensive network of couriers and business contacts across Europe, an information edge real enough in ordinary trading that it may help explain why a story crediting him with an almost supernatural advantage found such a receptive audience once it appeared. He judged correctly that a lasting peace would eventually push the price of British government bonds up, and he bought a large position in them once the war's outcome was clear, holding on as the post-war economy stabilized and the bonds rallied over the following years. The false version keeps circulating anyway, because a secret and a conspiracy make a far better story than a banker correctly guessing that peace, once it holds, tends to be good for bonds. Under China's Song Dynasty, in the closing years of the 10th century, merchants in the western region of Sichuan began issuing a new kind of financial instrument called jiaozi, promissory notes exchanged for deposits of coin, silk, or other valuables held at private firms. The innovation solved a specific physical problem. Sichuan's standard currency at the time was cast in heavy iron, rather than the bronze used elsewhere in China, and a purchase substantial enough to matter could require far more metal than anyone wanted to carry across a market, let alone a trade route. A paper note representing a claim on coin held safely elsewhere was quite simply lighter. What began as a private convenience among a handful of merchant firms spread quickly enough that the imperial government took notice, both of its usefulness and of the risk that private firms issuing their own currency posed to state control of money. In 1023, the government nationalized the practice, establishing an official bureau to issue and regulate jiaozi directly, making it, by the consensus of numismatic historians, the first paper currency issued and backed by a state anywhere in the world. Early jiaozi notes carried a limited validity of only a few years, after which holders had to exchange them for a newly issued batch for a small fee, a design meant to keep the total amount of paper in circulation from growing unchecked. The system was not without its later troubles. Subsequent Chinese dynasties, issuing paper under new names such as Huizi, would struggle repeatedly with the temptation to print more money than the economy could support, a lesson each seemed to need to relearn for itself. But the core idea, that a piece of paper could function as money if enough people trusted the authority standing behind it, had been proven workable centuries before any European government dared to tell us the same thing. China discovered paper money the way most useful inventions arrive, by someone getting tired of carrying something heavy. When the Venetian merchant Marco Polo returned to Europe after roughly 2 decades traveling through Asia, much of it in the service of the Mongol Emperor Kublai Khan, he brought back an account of the Yuan court's finances that many of his readers simply refused to believe. Polo described paper notes, produced from the inner bark of mulberry trees, stamped with official seals, and declared legal tender throughout the empire by decree of the emperor himself, with counterfeiting punishable by death. To a European audience accustomed to gold, silver, and copper as the only things that could plausibly count as money, the idea of an emperor simply declaring paper to be currency and having the declaration hold sounded less like reporting and more like traveler's exaggeration, one embellishment among the many later readers assumed padded his book. The book became known popularly in Italian as Il Milione, the million, a nickname some historians trace to the sheer abundance of extraordinary claims readers felt it contained. Wealth, distances, and populations all described in figures that struck contemporary Europeans as wildly inflated. Polo, dictating his account years later to a fellow prisoner during a period of captivity in Genoa, seems to have anticipated the disbelief. He described the paper currency system in careful, almost defensive detail, insisting on its reality. He was, as it happened, describing something entirely real. Paper currency backed by state authority had been functioning in China for roughly 2 centuries by the time Polo witnessed it. Refined and expanded under Mongol rule into an empire-wide system, Europe would not seriously attempt to copy for hundreds of years afterward. Later research, drawing on Chinese and Mongol records unavailable to Polo's original skeptics, has confirmed enough of his more improbable claims that modern historians treat the account as broadly reliable, despite the embellishments any medieval travelogue accumulated in the retelling. It is a peculiar kind of irony that one civilization's unremarkable financial paperwork became, in the retelling, one of the more disputed claims in a book already suspected of stretching the truth. In 1494, a Franciscan friar and mathematician named Luca Pacioli published a massive volume summarizing the mathematical knowledge of his age, and tucked within its many sections was something that would outlast nearly everything else in the book: the first printed description of double-entry bookkeeping, a method for recording every financial transaction twice, once as a debit and once as a matching credit. Pacioli did not invent the technique himself. Merchants in Venice and other Italian trading cities had been refining something close to it for at least a century before he wrote it down. Developed out of the sheer practical need to track increasingly complex trading ventures involving partners, shipments, and debts spread across multiple cities. What Pacioli did was codify the method clearly enough and distribute it widely enough through the new technology of the printing press that merchants across Europe could learn a system that had previously spread only through apprenticeship and word of mouth. Pacioli's own life connected directly to the wider world he helped equip with better arithmetic. He taught mathematics to Leonardo da Vinci, and Leonardo later illustrated the geometric figures in a separate book, partially wrote on proportion. A reminder that the era's art and its accounting often shared the same small circle of minds. The elegance of the bookkeeping method lies in its built-in check. If every transaction is entered twice, once on each side of the ledger, the two columns must balance at the end of any accounting period. If they do not, an error exists somewhere in the books, and the discrepancy itself points toward where to look. This turned bookkeeping from a private record of memory and trust into something closer to a self-correcting system, one where a bank, a trading house, or eventually a modern corporation could be checked by anyone who understood the method, not just by the person who kept the books. Merchants had always needed to know what they owned and what they owed. Pacioli simply gave the world a reliable way to make the two sides answer to each other. On the small Micronesian island of Wahap, communities developed a form of currency unlike almost anything else in monetary history. Enormous discs of stone, some taller than a person, quarried from limestone deposits on a distant island, and transported back across open water on rafts and canoes, at considerable risk and cost. The effort required to bring a single stone home was, in a real sense, part of the point. A stone's value depended partly on its size, but also on the difficulty and danger of the specific voyage that brought it there, and how many lives the journey had cost. Factors the community weighed into its shared sense of what the stone was actually worth as much as its diameter. The most striking detail, and the one that has drawn economists and anthropologists to Wahap ever since, is what happened to some of the very largest stones. A few, lost overboard in a storm during transit, or simply too massive to move again once they had arrived, were never physically relocated at all. They sat where they landed, sometimes at the bottom of the lagoon, while ownership of the stones still changed hands through trade, debt settlement, or marriage, tracked entirely by the community's shared memory of who currently held the claim to it. Nobody needed to see the stone, touch it, or move it for the transaction to be real. The island's residents simply agreed on who owned what, and that agreement functioned exactly the way a bank ledger does anywhere else in the world, without a single coin ever leaving the lagoon floor. Wahap's oral tradition of tracking ownership without any written deed has made the island a frequent case study for economists trying to explain, to skeptical students, that money has always ultimately rested on shared belief rather than the physical object itself. Wahap stones make plain something easy to miss about money everywhere else. The object was never really the point, only the shared, trusted record of who owes whom. Long before coined metal reached large parts of Africa, South Asia, and the Pacific, cowrie shells, small, glossy, and durable, gathered chiefly from shallow waters around the Maldive Islands in the Indian Ocean, circulated across those regions as a working currency for well over 1,000 years. Their qualities suited the job better than almost anything else available locally. Uniform enough in size and shape to count rather than weigh. Sturdy enough to survive long overland and sea trade routes without damage, and difficult enough to fake at any meaningful scale that counterfeiting never became a serious threat to the system. Trade networks moved cowries thousands of miles from the shallow waters where they were harvested to inland markets in West Africa and beyond, where they were counted out in strings and used for everything from daily market purchases to the payment of fines and tribute. European trading companies eventually recognized the shell's value on African and Asian markets and began importing them by the shipload specifically to trade for goods, in effect exporting a currency they had no ability to counterfeit themselves, since cowries could only be gathered, never minted. In Bengal, cowries served this small change well into the 19th century, used alongside silver and copper coins for transactions too small to justify metal currency at all. Colonial-era administrations, arriving later with their own coined currencies, gradually displaced the cowrie across most of the regions that had relied on it, often at exchange rates set by the colonizing power itself, rather than by the communities who had used the shells for generations. The transition cost those communities more than a simple change of currency. It dismantled trading relationships and pricing customs the cowrie had quietly organized for centuries. Some communities strung cowries into standardized lengths, specifically to make larger transactions easier to count at a glance. An informal denomination system layered on top of a currency nobody had ever formally minted. A shell that once crossed oceans to become money eventually became, across most of the world, simply a shell again. The English word salary is commonly said to trace back to the Latin salarium, understood popularly as the portion of a Roman soldier's pay specifically earmarked for buying salt, a substance valuable enough in the ancient world to preserve meat, season food, and apparently justify building an entire payment category around it. It is a tidy story, repeated in classrooms and trivia books alike, and it captures something true about how valuable salt once was. The historical reality underneath the phrase is less tidy. Roman sources do connect the word salarium to salt in some fashion, but scholars disagree about the precise mechanism. Whether soldiers ever literally received salt itself as pay, whether salarium instead referred to money allocated for purchasing salt, or whether the connection had simply faded into general usage as meaning wages by the time most surviving references were written down. The etymological thread is real. Exactly how literal it ever was, 2,000 years and countless retellings later, is harder to pin down than the popular version admits. Latin left behind more than one financial fossil of this kind. The word pecuniary descends from pecus, meaning cattle or livestock, a much less disputed reminder that livestock itself functioned as an early store and measure of value long before coins existed, in Rome and in plenty of cultures well beyond it. Salt's broader value in the ancient world is not in question either way. It preserved food long before refrigeration existed, was taxed, monopolized, and fought over by governments across multiple continents, and shows up as a unit of trade and tribute in societies that never had any contact with Rome at all. Whether any given ancient writer understood the full arrangement is itself part of the puzzle, since surviving Latin sources on the subject are fragmentary enough that competing modern translations do not always agree on the details. Whatever the precise arrangement Roman soldiers actually received, the word they left behind still shows up on every payslip written in English, carrying a grain of ancient salt no one bothers to taste for anymore. The Knights Templar, founded in the early 12th century to protect Christian pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land, grew over the following 200 years into something considerably larger than a military order, a financial network spanning Christendom, built on properties, donations, and the trust placed in a fighting force with a reputation at the time for discipline and honesty in equal measure. That reputation solved a genuine problem for pilgrims. Carrying a meaningful sum of coin across hundreds of miles of medieval roads, through territory with no shortage of bandits, was dangerous enough that many travelers avoided it entirely. The Templars offered an alternative. A pilgrim could deposit funds at a Templar house in Europe, receive a coded letter of credit in return, and present that letter at a Templar commandery near their destination in the Holy Land to withdraw an equivalent sum without ever carrying the actual coin across the dangerous stretch in between. The system relied on coded letters difficult to forge and a network eventually encompassing several hundred commanderies and estates, stretching from Britain to the Levant, a physical infrastructure of castles, farms, and fortified houses that made the order, quite apart from its military reputation, one of medieval Europe's largest single landholders. Running this system required exactly what a modern bank requires: a network of trusted locations, a way to verify a claim was genuine, and enough scale that the organization could cover withdrawals in one place against deposits made somewhere else entirely. The Templars built all three, centuries before European banking would formalize similar practices under its own name. The order's fortune did not survive it. In the early 14th century, a heavily indebted French king moved against the Templars, arresting its leadership and seizing much of its wealth, and the order was formally dissolved within a few years. A network built on trust across dangerous distances turned out in the end to be no match for a king who owed it money. In 1521, Jakob Fugger, a German banker whose fortune rivaled that of any monarch in Europe, signed the founding deed for a walled settlement of small houses in his home city of Ogwesburg, intended to shelter the city's deserving poor, craftsmen and laborers who had fallen on hard times through no obvious fault of their own. The complex, known as the Fuggerei, opened its first homes within a few years, and has been continuously inhabited ever since, making it, by most accounts, the oldest social housing project still operating anywhere in the world. The terms were, and largely remain, strikingly simple. Residents pay an annual rent equivalent to roughly 1 Rhenish guilder, a sum so small by modern standards that it comes to well under €1 a year, along with an obligation to say daily prayers for the souls of the Fugger family who endowed the place. In exchange, they receive housing inside a self-contained walled community with its own church, still standing 5 centuries after the first residents moved in. The complex was heavily damaged during bombing raids in the Second World War and was subsequently rebuilt, and it continues operating today under terms recognizably close to Fugger's original deed, housing residents of Oakwesburg who can demonstrate genuine need, a 500-year continuity remarkably few charitable institutions, let alone banking fortunes, can claim. Fugger built the Fuggerei from a fortune made lending money to popes and Holy Roman emperors, hardly a charitable business by nature. And the almshouse sits somewhat oddly alongside the harder-edged banking operations that funded it. Whatever the mix of piety, reputation, and genuine generosity behind the decision, the arithmetic of the gift itself has held up. A small fraction of one man's wealth, directed toward permanent housing rather than a single act of charity, is still sheltering people who were not yet born when the last Fugger banker died. Few fortunes outlive the family that made them, but this one, oddly, still charges its own small rent. Long before Jakob Fugger endowed housing for Oegigsberg's poor, his family had built one of the largest banking fortunes in Europe on a considerably less charitable foundation. Mining rights across Central Europe, particularly copper and silver, combined with merchant trading and, most lucratively, direct lending to the continent's royal houses. The mining concessions at the center of the arrangement centered on copper deposits in the Tyrol and silver mines in Hungary, resources Fugger controlled closely enough that his firm effectively set prices for copper across much of Europe for a period. That lending reached its most consequential moment in 1519, when the death of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I triggered a contested election among the continent's most powerful ruling families to choose his successor. Imperial elections in this period ran substantially on bribery. The electors who cast the votes expected to be paid handsomely for their support, and the candidates needed enormous sums of ready credit to compete. Jakob Fugger extended a loan large enough to help secure the election for the Habsburg candidate, who became the Emperor Charles V, cementing a Habsburg grip on the imperial title that would last for centuries, and tying the Fugger fortune directly to one of the most consequential political outcomes of the era. The relationship worked in both directions. Fugger's loans bought him access, favorable mining concessions, and repayment terms few other lenders could have negotiated, while the Habsburgs gained the ready credit that hereditary land and title alone could not provide quickly enough. Charles V's debts to the family were never fully settled, even after Fugger's own death, a reminder that lending to a crown, however profitable in the short run, rarely came with any guarantee of complete repayment. The same family that later built almshouses for the poor had, a few years earlier, quietly helped decide who would wear an emperor's crown. In a series of experiments conducted by the economist Richard Taylor and his collaborators, researchers handed out ordinary coffee mugs to half the participants in a room, then asked the mug owners to name a price at which they would be willing to sell, while asking the participants who had received nothing to name a price at which they would be willing to buy. Economic theory offers a clean prediction here. Since the mugs were distributed at random and both groups were otherwise similar, the two prices should land somewhere close to each other. They never did. Owners consistently demanded roughly twice what buyers were willing to offer for the exact same object, handed to them only minutes earlier. Simply holding a thing, even briefly and even by pure chance, appeared to inflate how much the holder believed it was worth. The original study, published in 1990 by Kahneman, working alongside Taylor and the economist Jack Konech, ran the experiment several different ways to rule out simpler explanations, and the gap between selling and buying prices held up consistently regardless of the variation tested. Researchers named the pattern the endowment effect, and it has since turned up well beyond mugs, in negotiations over houses, cars, and inherited belongings that owners routinely value far above what any outside buyer would offer. Real estate agents encounter a version of the effect constantly. Homeowners pricing a house for sale routinely anchor to a figure well above what comparable properties have actually fetched, driven less by market data than by the simple, stubborn fact that the house is theirs. It helps explain why a seller so often feels a fair counteroffer is insulting, and why people cling to possessions and investments, partly because the things are already theirs, quite apart from any assessment of current worth. Ownership does not just describe a relationship between a person and an object. It quietly edits the number the person attaches to it. The Concorde supersonic passenger jet, developed jointly by the British and French governments starting in the 1960s, faced clear signs of commercial trouble well before it ever carried a paying passenger. Internal cost projections and market studies suggested at multiple points during its long development that the aircraft would never recoup what had already been spent building it, let alone turn any future profit. Both governments kept funding it anyway, for years, well past the point most outside observers agree the economic case had collapsed. National prestige, as much as economics, kept the project alive through several points where cancellation would have been the financially sound choice. Withdrawing looked, to the governments funding it, like admitting failure on a public stage neither wanted to concede. The pattern is common enough, in institutions and individuals alike, that economists gave it a name borrowed directly from the aircraft. The Concorde fallacy, a specific case of the more general sunk cost fallacy. Money, time, or effort already spent is by definition gone. No decision made today can retrieve it. Rational choice, in theory, should weigh only the costs and benefits still ahead, ignoring what has already been poured into a project. In practice, the sheer size of the past investment exerts its own pull, making abandonment feel like an admission that the money already spent was wasted, even though continuing to spend does nothing to undo that. Only a small number of the aircraft were ever built, and most operated at a loss for their entire working lives, subsidized quietly by the same governments that had once promised the project would eventually pay for itself. The same pattern shows up at a far smaller scale constantly, finishing a bad meal because it was already paid for, sitting through a disappointing film because tickets were already bought, staying in a failing venture specifically because so much has already gone into it. Concorde flew for 27 years, elegant and always short of profitable, a monument to how hard it is to walk away from a bill already paid. Offer most people a choice between receiving a smaller sum of money today or a meaningfully larger sum 1 month from now, and a large share will take the smaller amount immediately. Offer the same people a choice between a smaller sum in 12 months or a larger sum in 13, and most switch, choosing to wait the extra month for the bigger payout. The two choices involve exactly the same trade-off, an extra month's wait in exchange for more money. Yet people answer them differently depending on whether the wait starts now or starts later. Researchers call this pattern hyperbolic discounting, and it describes something more specific than simple impatience. People do not discount the future at a steady, consistent rate, the way a fair loan calculates interest. Instead, the pull toward immediate reward is disproportionately strong, specifically when immediate means right now, and weakens noticeably once any delay, even a short one, stands between the person and the reward. Economists studying the pattern have found it applies unevenly across different kinds of decisions. People show far steeper discounting for money specifically than they do for some other rewards, and the effect grows more pronounced the smaller and more immediately available the reward on offer happens to be. The practical effects are everywhere in how people actually handle money. Retirement savings, favorable in almost any rational accounting, lose out constantly to smaller immediate spending, not because people cannot do the math, but because the future self who benefits from the saving feels, in the moment of choosing, considerably less real than the present self who wants the money now. Behavioral economists, including Richard Taylor, have pointed to the pattern as one reason automatic savings programs, which remove the moment of choice entirely, rather than relying on willpower each time, tend to outperform programs that simply ask people to decide to save more. Time, when money is involved, does not pass at a steady rate inside anyone's head, and the very next moment always weighs more than it should. In 1776, the economist Adam Smith posed a puzzle that would occupy his successors for the better part of a century. Nothing, he observed, is more useful to human survival than water. A person can live only days without it, yet water commanded almost no price at all in most places people could get it. Diamonds, meanwhile, serve almost no practical purpose beyond ornament, and yet a small handful of them could be traded for a great quantity of other goods. If value simply tracked usefulness, the puzzle runs, water should be priced far above diamonds, not the other way around. Smith noted the paradox without fully resolving it, and the gap sat unanswered in economic thought for roughly a century. Three economists working independently of one another in the early 1870s, the Austrian Karl Menger, the Englishman William Stanley Jevons, and the Frenchman Leon Walras, arrived at close variations of the same solution at nearly the same time, a rare case in the history of ideas where three people in three different countries solved an old puzzle within a few years of each other without any of them aware the others were working on it. Their shared idea was marginal value. Price does not track how useful an entire category of goods is in the abstract. It tracks how useful the next available unit of that good is to the person deciding whether to buy it. Water, in most places, is abundant enough that the next glass costs almost nothing to obtain, so it commands almost no price, however essential the category is to life itself. Diamonds are scarce enough that the next one is genuinely hard to get, so people will pay heavily for it, however little practical use it actually serves. Scarcity, not importance, sets the price at the margin. Take away all the water in a place, though, and the paradox reverses instantly, proof that it was never really about diamonds at all. When a group of Dutch merchants founded the United East India Company in 1602, later known by its Dutch initials as the VOC, they solved a problem that had limited trading ventures for centuries. Earlier voyages typically raised money for a single trip, paid investors back once the ships returned with cargo, and then dissolved, requiring the whole arrangement to be rebuilt from scratch for the next expedition. The VOC instead offered something new: shares representing permanent ownership in an ongoing enterprise, which investors could buy and, crucially, sell to someone else whenever they wished, without waiting for any particular voyage to complete. An investor who needed cash before the ships came home no longer had to simply wait. They could sell their stake to another buyer on the exchange that quickly grew up around the company's shares in Amsterdam. That liquidity, the ability to exit an investment by finding another buyer rather than waiting for the underlying venture to finish, is the feature that makes a modern stock market function at all. And the VOC is widely credited as the first company to offer it at meaningful scale. The company paid dividends to its shareholders for the better part of 2 centuries, at times exceeding what its own annual profits could strictly justify, financed instead by fresh capital raised from new investors, a practice that quietly stored up trouble for later. The company itself went on to dominate trade between Europe and Asia for the better part of 2 centuries, operating something close to a private empire with its own armies, forts, and treaties, before corruption, mismanagement, and costly wars finally caught up with it. Weighed down by debt, the VOC collapsed into insolvency by the close of the 18th century, and the Dutch government formally dissolved it in 1799, absorbing what remained of its debts and colonial holdings. Whatever else the VOC became, it left behind an invention that outlasted the company itself by centuries, a market where ownership, not just cargo, could change hands on an ordinary afternoon. In 1609, the city of Amsterdam established a public institution called the Wissel Bank, the Bank of Amsterdam, built to solve a specific and irritating problem for the merchants who had made the city one of Europe's busiest trading hubs. The sheer chaos of coinage actually circulating there, minted by dozens of different states and cities, worn down to different degrees and often clipped or debased in ways that made every transaction a small negotiation over what a given coin was actually still worth. The bank's solution was to accept deposits of this jumble of coin and bullion and credit depositors with a stable, uniform unit of account on its own books, a form of money that existed only as a ledger entry, but that the bank guaranteed, reliably and for generations, to be backed exactly by the metal it claimed to hold. Merchants settling large trades increasingly preferred to simply transfer this bank money between accounts, rather than physically count out coins of uncertain quality, and bank money came to trade at a premium over an equivalent face value in actual circulating coin. A remarkable vote of confidence for an institution whose entire product was, in effect, a claim on metal sitting in a vault elsewhere in the city. That reputation for absolute reliability held for well over a century, but records opened long after the bank's closure revealed that its directors had, in fact, secretly lent out a portion of the very reserves depositors believed sat untouched in the vault, quietly funding the struggling Dutch East India Company and the city of Amsterdam itself. When the scale of these hidden loans finally became public in the 1790s, confidence collapsed, and the bank that had once made trust more valuable than metal did not survive discovering what happens once that trust turns out to have been only partly earned. Trust, once an institution has earned enough of it, can apparently be worth more than the metal sitting behind it, right up until someone finally checks the vault. For much of the Middle Ages, charging interest on a loan was not merely frowned upon in Christian Europe. It was formally classified as usury, a sin condemned by church councils and church law alike. The philosophical backing for the ban traced back to Aristotle, who had argued centuries earlier that money was, by its nature, sterile. A coin could not naturally produce more coins the way a flock of sheep produces lambs or a field produces grain. So charging interest for the mere use of money over time amounted to profiting from something that should not by its nature be able to grow. The poet Dante gave the doctrine one of its most vivid expressions, placing usurers in his Inferno among those guilty of violence against nature and art. Seated alongside blasphemers as people who had turned a fundamentally unnatural act into their livelihood. The condemnation was not merely theoretical. Confessors could refuse absolution to unrepentant moneylenders, and some medieval wills include awkward, last-minute restitution payments meant to unwind a lifetime of interest collected before death arrived. Commercial reality, however, kept pressing against the doctrine, and merchants found workarounds well before it formally softened. The bill of exchange, a financial instrument that built a hidden currency conversion fee into an ordinary trade transaction, let a lender earn a real return on money advanced across cities without ever calling it interest outright. Franciscan friars eventually established their own low-interest pawnshops for the poor, known as Montes Pietatis, arguing that a small, transparent charge covering the pawnshop's own running costs was categorically different from usury, a distinction that helped the church begin accepting some interest as legitimate, well before it formally revised the underlying doctrine. Interest rates that did eventually operate legally across medieval Europe were often capped by local statute, an echo of the same instinct that shaped Hammurabi's ceilings thousands of years earlier. However differently the two eras justified the limit. Money, it turned out, learned to breed after all. Theology simply took a few centuries to stop insisting otherwise. In the 1680s, a coffee house near the London docks run by a man named Edward Lloyd became an unlikely meeting point for shipowners, merchants, and the individuals willing to underwrite the risk of a voyage in exchange for a fee. A single ship lost at sea could ruin the merchant who owned its cargo outright. Spread across enough backers, each risking only a small share, the same loss became survivable for everyone involved, while the rare total loss was absorbed collectively rather than catastrophically by one party alone. Lloyd's Coffee House eventually began publishing its own shipping newspaper, Lloyd's List, tracking vessel movements and losses for its regular patrons, a publication that in one form or another still exists today, considerably longer lived than the coffee house itself. The informal network that grew out of the coffee house eventually formalized into one of the world's most recognized names in marine insurance, its underwriting structure of individual backers, each committing to cover a slice of a given risk, remaining recognizably intact for centuries afterward. A related insight had already been tested closer to home. After the Great Fire of London in 1666 destroyed a huge portion of the city, built mostly from timber and packed tightly enough that flames spread from one property to the next within hours, a builder and economist named Nicholas Barbon recognized the same pooling logic could apply to fire as readily as to shipwreck. He established one of England's first dedicated fire insurance companies within a few years of the fire, charging property owners a regular premium in exchange for compensation if their building burned. Both threads, ships lost at sea and buildings lost to flame, rest on the same underlying arithmetic. A loss too large for one person to absorb becomes manageable once its cost is spread thinly across many people who each pay a little, most of whom will never need to collect anything at all. Insurance does not prevent the fire or the storm, it simply decides, in advance, who helps pay for it. In the 17th century, a Neapolitan banker named Lorenzo de' Tonti proposed a financing scheme to the French crown that solved a real fiscal problem in an unusually direct way. Subscribers would each contribute a sum to a shared fund, and the fund would pay out annual dividends not to each subscriber individually in proportion to their share, but divided among however many subscribers were still alive that year. As members died, the survivors' individual shares of the payout grew larger, until in the scheme's purest form, the single last subscriber standing collected whatever remained of the entire fund. Governments across Europe adopted versions of the tontine over the following 2 centuries as a way to borrow money relatively cheaply, since subscribers were effectively betting a portion of their investment on their own longevity rather than demanding a fixed rate of return regardless of who lived or died. For the subscribers themselves, the arrangement created a genuinely unusual incentive. Each participant's financial interest was tied directly to how many of their fellow subscribers were still breathing. Tontines eventually developed a dark reputation in fiction, disproportionate to how often anything sinister actually happened among real subscribers. Most memorably in Robert Louis Stevenson's comic novel, The Wrong Box, built entirely around the tangled inheritance chaos a tontine's final payout could cause. American life insurance companies ran a large-scale version of the scheme through the late 1800s, until a series of scandals over how the companies managed the pooled funds led several states to ban the practice outright by the early 1900s. Whether any individual subscriber actually wished harm on their fellow tontine members is naturally unknowable, and probably varied considerably from person to person. Tontines eventually fell out of favor with governments, replaced by more straightforward bonds, but the shape of the wager it offered, betting on your own survival against a room full of strangers, has never entirely disappeared from insurance and pension design. Traditional Confucian social philosophy, which shaped official thinking across many Chinese dynasties for roughly 2,000 years, organized society into 4 broad occupational classes ranked by their presumed contribution to the common good. Scholars who studied and administered sat at the top. Farmers came next, honored for producing the grain that fed everyone else. Artisans who made useful goods with their own hands ranked third. Merchants, whatever their personal wealth, were placed at the very bottom. The reasoning behind the ranking was not that merchants lacked money. Many were in fact considerably richer than the farmers, and even the scholars nominally ranked above them. The objection was structural. A merchant, in this view, produced nothing new. Goods that a farmer grew or an artisan crafted already existed in the world. The merchant merely moved them from one place to another and took a share of the value in between. Profit without production, in a framework that prized visible, tangible contribution to the community's material needs. Sumptuary laws in some periods went further still, restricting what merchants were permitted to wear or how elaborately they could build their homes, regardless of what they could actually afford. A formal effort to keep displayed status in line with official rank, even as actual wealth had long since diverged from it. This official hierarchy shaped policy in concrete ways across various dynasties, restricting merchants from certain official positions and taxing commercial wealth heavily at times. Wealthy merchant families frequently responded by investing in their sons' classical education, seeking the higher status of the scholar class that money itself could not purchase directly. And the tension eased only gradually as commercial wealth became harder for any dynasty to simply legislate away. Japan and Korea developed broadly similar hierarchies under their own Confucian-influenced traditions, ranking merchants last for much the same reason, evidence of how far the underlying idea traveled beyond China's own borders. A society can rank money below scholarship and farming on paper, while still, in practice, quietly reorganizing itself around whoever actually holds it. Seneca the Younger, the Roman philosopher, playwright, and statesman, wrote extensively in the Stoic tradition about the proper relationship between a person and their possessions, arguing in one often quoted line that it is not the man who has too little, but the man who craves more, who ought to be counted poor. Wealth, in his framework, was never the problem in itself. The endless appetite for more of it was. The argument sits uneasily beside the life of the man making it. Seneca was, by the account of his contemporaries, one of the wealthiest private individuals in the Roman world, having accumulated an enormous fortune, partly through his position as advisor to the Emperor Nero, including substantial money lent out at interest across the province of Britain. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing decades after Seneca's death, pointedly listed the philosopher's massive loans and landholdings as evidence of hypocrisy, going so far as to suggest, though the claim is far from settled among historians, that Seneca's aggressive loan recalls in Britain may have contributed to unrest there. Critics at the time noted the apparent contradiction between a philosopher counseling restraint from within one of the largest private fortunes anyone in Rome could claim, and the gap has followed his reputation ever since. Seneca's own end came at Nero's command. The emperor he had once advised and profited alongside eventually ordered his forced suicide, a fittingly severe final lesson from a life spent writing about how little any of it, wealth included, ultimately protects a person from fortune's reversal. Modern biographers of Seneca have generally read the contradiction as revealing, rather than damning, evidence that insight into a problem and immunity from it have never been quite the same thing, in Rome or anywhere since. Whatever Seneca actually did with his fortune, the observation itself has outlasted him by 2,000 years. The poverty that matters most rarely has much to do with the number in anyone's ledger. In 1824, a Royal Navy pay clerk named John Dickens was arrested for a debt he could not pay and sent to the Marshalsea, a debtor's prison in London, along with most of his family, since the practice at the time allowed a debtor's household to move in with him inside the prison walls rather than fend for themselves outside it. His 12-year-old son Charles was instead sent to work at a shoe polish factory to help support the family, a period the future novelist rarely discussed openly and never entirely stopped writing about in one form or another. Debtors' prisons operated on a logic that, examined closely, worked against its own stated purpose. A person imprisoned for owing money had no meaningful way to earn the money required to pay the debt and secure release, since prison offered little opportunity for paid work, leaving many debtors dependent on relatives, charity, or sheer luck to eventually buy their own freedom. Conditions inside varied sharply depending on a prisoner's remaining means. Those who could still scrape together small payments rented marginally better rooms and modest privileges, while the truly destitute crowded into the prison's poorest wards, a hierarchy of poverty operating within the walls of a prison built entirely because of poverty. The system punished poverty as though it were a moral failing to be confined, rather than a financial circumstance to be resolved. Charles Dickens drew on the memory of his father's imprisonment across several novels, most directly and extensively in Little Dorrit, whose title character is born inside the Marshalsea itself. His writing is often credited with shaping public sentiment against debtors' prisons in Britain, which were gradually phased out over the following decades. The Marshalsea itself closed in 1842 and was later largely demolished, though a wall and a few traces survive, quietly incorporated into the streets of Southwark. A system built to collect debts by removing a person's ability to earn money ended up, in his case, producing one of English literature's most persistent critics of exactly that arrangement. In 2010, the psychologist Daniel Kahneman and the economist Angus Deaton published a widely cited study concluding that emotional well-being rises with income only up to a certain point, after which further income produces no additional gain in day-to-day happiness, though a separate measure of overall life satisfaction kept climbing regardless. Their study relied on participants recalling their emotions from the previous day in a single retrospective survey, a method that can blur and average out real-time fluctuations in mood. The specific income threshold they identified traveled far beyond academic circles, repeated in articles and conversations for over a decade, as though it were a settled, permanent fact about human psychology. It was not quite settled. In 2021, the researcher Matthew Killingworth published a study using a different data collection method, pinging participants at random moments throughout their actual days to ask how they felt right then. A far more granular window into daily experience than a single retrospective survey could capture, and found no plateau at all. Happiness, in his data, kept rising with income, for most people, well beyond the original threshold. Rather than leaving two contradictory findings to sit in competition, Kahneman, Deaton, and Killingworth collaborated on a joint reanalysis published in 2023, working through their datasets together to see where the discrepancy actually came from. The reconciled picture holds that for most people, happiness does keep climbing with income considerably further than the original study suggested, and the flattening effect the 2010 study had detected was concentrated almost entirely among roughly the least happy fifth of the population, whose distress, the researchers suggested, likely stemmed from a fixed problem that no additional income could fully resolve. The reversal made news well beyond academic circles, since the original ceiling had been cited so often in so many unrelated contexts that correcting it required unwinding a decade of confident secondhand repetition. A specific number, repeated confidently enough for long enough, can outlive its own evidence by a decade before the field quietly gets around to correcting it. On an August evening in 1913, at the Monte Carlo casino, the ball on a roulette wheel landed on black. Then it landed on black again. By the time the streak reached 10 repetitions, a crowd had gathered around the table, drawn by word that something unusual was happening. The streak kept going, 15, 20, further still, and gamblers began piling money onto red, certain that after so many consecutive blacks, red was overwhelmingly due to appear. The wheel landed on black 26 times in a row before finally producing a red result, by which point substantial sums had changed hands, most of it flowing away from the gamblers who had bet against the streak continuing. Their reasoning felt intuitive and was completely wrong. A fair roulette wheel has no memory of its previous spins. Each one is statistically independent of every spin before it, meaning the odds of red or black on spin 27 were exactly the same as they had been on spin 1, regardless of how many times black had already appeared. Statisticians have since calculated that a run of 26 consecutive results on a single color is astonishingly unlikely on any given evening, which is precisely why the story endures as the field's defining example. The sheer rarity of the actual event makes the crowd's mistaken reasoning about it unusually vivid and easy to remember. Researchers call this mistaken intuition the gambler's fallacy, and it persists even among people who, asked directly, can state the correct mathematics without hesitation. Some researchers still call in the Monte Carlo fallacy specifically, tying the error permanently to the single evening that made it famous. Understanding that each spin is independent does not switch off the powerful, almost physical sense that a long streak of one outcome makes the opposite outcome overdue. Monte Carlo's wheel that night became the standard illustration of the fallacy, precisely because the numbers were so extreme and so expensive that no one who lost money betting against black ever quite forgot the lesson. Researchers studying slot machine behavior have identified a specific outcome that keeps players seated and pulling the lever considerably longer than an ordinary loss would: the near miss, a spin where 2 of 3 matching symbols land in place and the third stops just 1 position short of completing a jackpot. The outcome is, in every financial sense, identical to any other losing spin. Nothing is won, and the machine pays out nothing. The brain, measured through physiological responses like skin conductance and self-reported excitement, does not treat the two losses identically. A near miss produces a burst of arousal much closer to what an actual win produces than to what an ordinary, clearly wrong loss produces, even though the player's balance ends up exactly the same either way. The broader mechanism at work traces back to research on variable reward schedules, most famously studied by the psychologist B.F. Skinner, who found that rewards delivered unpredictably, rather than on a fixed and reliable schedule, produce the most persistent and hardest to extinguish behavior in both animals and people. A near miss functions as a particularly potent version of that unpredictability, a signal that a reward schedule is active and might pay out at any moment, even on a machine mathematically designed so that over enough spins, it never quite will. Gambling equipment manufacturers have understood this response well enough for long enough that modern slot machines are commonly designed and tested to produce near misses more frequently than pure random chance alone would generate, a deliberate calibration rather than an accident of the reels. The near miss keeps a losing session feeling like a win was just barely, tantalizingly out of reach, rather than like a series of straightforward losses. A near miss and a clear loss cost a player exactly the same amount of money, yet only one of them, somehow, feels like an invitation to try again. In 1889, the steel magnate Andrew Carnegie, by then one of the richest men in the United States, published an essay that became known as the Gospel of Wealth, arguing that a person who died possessing a great fortune had, in his words, died disgraced. Carnegie's position was specific, and for a man of his era and industry, unusual. The wealthy were not merely permitted to give their fortunes away, but morally obligated to do so during their own lifetimes, distributing the money themselves to causes that would genuinely benefit the public, rather than leaving the decision to heirs or worse, to an estate settled only after death. Carnegie backed the argument with his own money. Over the final decades of his life, he gave away the overwhelming majority of the fortune he had built in the steel industry, funding several thousand public libraries across the English-speaking world, along with universities, concert halls, and various scientific and educational institutions, working to place the money while he could still oversee where it went, rather than trust the task to others afterward. The philanthropic institutions he founded, including the Carnegie Corporation of New York, have continued operating and funding causes for more than a century after his death, considerably outlasting the steel company that built the fortune in the first place. Critics then and since have pointed to the strike at Carnegie's Homestead steel plant in 1892, during which serious conflict broke out between striking workers and private security forces, while Carnegie himself stayed overseas, as the sharpest counterpoint to his later reputation as a benefactor. The essay's argument and the life that produced the fortune it was arguing about do not entirely sit comfortably together. Carnegie's own rise from a poor immigrant boy working in a cotton mill to one of the era's wealthiest industrialists is itself part of why his argument carried unusual weight with contemporaries who could not simply dismiss him as someone who had never known scarcity. Whatever judgment history renders on how the money was made, remarkably little of it, by the time Carnegie died, was still his. A specific warning about family wealth appears, in slightly different wording, across cultures that had no meaningful contact with one another. English speakers say shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations, describing a family that rises from labor into wealth, only to sink back into labor within 3 generations' time. An old Chinese saying holds that wealth never survives 3 generations. Italian has its own version tracing a similar arc, and variations appear in proverbs from other traditions entirely, each landing on roughly the same number of generations before a fortune dissipates. The German novelist Thomas Mann built an entire multi-generational novel, Bud and Brooks, around exactly this arc, tracing a merchant family's decline in wealth and vitality across 4 generations, a fictional treatment so recognizable to readers that the pattern it describes is sometimes still called, informally, Bud and Brooks syndrome. Researchers who study family businesses have found the pattern shows up often enough in actual data to be more than coincidence or folklore. The generation that builds a fortune typically does so under real scarcity, developing habits of risk assessment, thrift, and hard bargaining, forged by necessity rather than choice. Their children, raised amid the results of that labor rather than the labor itself, absorb some of those lessons secondhand, imperfectly. Their grandchildren, having never experienced scarcity directly at all, frequently lack the instincts that built the fortune in the first place, even while inheriting the responsibility of managing it. Family business researchers point to succession planning, inheritance structures, and each generation's relationship to risk as the practical mechanisms behind the proverb, rather than any mysterious curse attached to wealth itself, more a matter of shifting incentives and skills across generations than any single dramatic cause. That cultures separated by oceans and centuries arrived independently at nearly the same warning suggests the pattern was never really a matter of superstition, only something enough grandchildren everywhere kept living out. In the spring of 1720, Isaac Newton, by then one of the most celebrated scientific minds in Europe, held shares in the South Sea Company and sold them for a solid profit as the stock climbed. The price kept rising after his exit, and Newton, watching what looked like continued easy money pass him by, bought back in near the top of the market. Months later, the company's stock collapsed entirely, part of a broader financial panic that swept through London that summer, and Newton lost a substantial fortune, reportedly around £20,000, an enormous sum for the period. He is said to have remarked afterward that he could calculate the motions of the heavenly bodies, but not the madness of people, a line that later writers have polished and embellished over the centuries until its exact original wording is impossible to pin down with certainty. The sentiment behind it, though, matches what historians can document about his actual experience closely enough that they treat the story as essentially reliable, however much the precise phrasing has drifted. The wider collapse Newton was caught in swept up thousands of other investors across Britain that same summer, prompting Parliament to pass the Bubble Act, legislation restricting the formation of new joint stock companies without a royal charter, a law that would slow the development of British corporate enterprise for the following century. The episode has become one of finance's most quoted cautionary tales, precisely because of who it happened to. Understanding gravity, motion, and the mathematics underlying the physical universe evidently offered no particular protection against watching a rising price and wanting a piece of it, the same pull that has moved money in and out of every mania this list has touched. Newton, despite the loss, remained one of the wealthiest scientists of his age at his death several years later. The South Sea losses a dent in a large fortune rather than a ruinous one. Newton solved the heavens, the crowd he never quite figured out. The ledger from the beginning of this list is closed now, whichever merchant was holding it. History rarely tells anyone in the moment which certainty was about to be proven right and which was about to be proven merely comfortable. That gap between feeling right and being right is where almost everything in this list actually lived. 50 rules is a strange number to sit with all at once, and this list was never going to resolve into one clean lesson at the end, because money itself never resolves into one clean lesson. It is not a subject with a bottom. Every era that believed it had finally figured money out, that this generation's coins, contracts, or convictions were somehow more solid than the last ones, has eventually discovered the same quiet correction history keeps handing everyone. Certainty about money is usually a feeling, not a fact, and the two only line up by accident about as often as they line up by wisdom. Sit with enough of these stories back to back, and a shape starts to emerge that no single one of them could show on its own. Wealth behaves less like a possession and more like a weather system, moving through generations, households, and empires according to a logic that rewards patience far more reliably than it rewards cleverness, and forgets almost nobody's mistakes, even the quiet ones nobody else ever finds out about. None of this was ever offered as instruction. Nobody watching needs to be told what to do with their own money. Plenty of people are already paid handsomely to do that badly. What this list offered instead was simply time spent with the pattern itself, the long repeating, oddly comforting record of how people have handled fortune and its absence since long before anyone thought to write either down. The candle by that first ledger is still burning, low and unhurried, in no rush at all to say how the story ends, because it never really does.